point number one to keep in mind. All of these trade restrictions end up simply increasing the domestic price that consumers have to pay. It just increases the price. Number two, let's look at domestic consumption. Consistently, across all of these trade restrictions, domestic consumption drops. Consistently, domestic consumption will drop. Domestic production, on the other hand, increases at the expense of the consumer and at the expense of domestic consumption dropping because demand will decrease at higher prices. There's number three. So the big question is, does the drop in domestic consumption is it smaller than the increase we're going to get from domestic production? Are the benefits associated with this, whether they be economic or political benefits, let's not forget, we have politicians making up their minds about these things. There might be no economic benefit. You always got to be aware of yourself. Does that make 150? If it was produced in the state and sold in the state, it had to be done
in the last video, we saw how you can actually view a demand curve as actually a marginal. This is a marginal benefit for that. Let's say if you want to sell 2 units, that second unit might be bought by that same person, and they might say, well, I already have 1 car. The benefit of getting that second one's only $50,000. That's the point at which I am neutral. That's the point at which I'm right on the fence of willing to buy that car. Or it might be another person who's just not as enamored as the first person says, okay, for $50,000, I do like that car. And then for the third person there, once again, they're not as enamored as the first two. They would be willing to buy it for $40,000. And what we saw is, at some point, you could say, look, let's say we decide that the price ends up being, for whatever reason, the price ends up being $30,000. $30,000. And so when the price is $30,000, we saw, and this is kind of viewing it in the traditional notion of at a price, what quantity we were selling it. But when you think about that reality, what's actually happening is that this fourth person is right on the fence. Their marginal benefit is exactly $30,000. So in their mind, they're saying, I am giving away $30,000, and in exchange for that, I'm getting something that is worth $30,000. So it's kind of like, hey, will you be willing to trade this dollar for a dollar? Well, you'd probably be kind of on the fence about that. You're very close to going either way. You feel like it's a good deal if you could get it for maybe a penny less. It's a bad deal, or if you were getting it for a penny more. So right on the fence, but you're going to just barely get this fourth person to transact at this price. But what we hinted at is if you do have one price for everybody, and in the future we'll talk about not having one price for everybody, but if you did have one price for everyone, these first units were kind of sold below where they could have been sold. They were sold below their marginal benefit. So remember, we're viewing this, the same demand curve, we're now viewing as a marginal benefit curve. So this first unit right over here, it could have been sold at $60,000, but now we're selling it for $30,000. So this right over here, this was $30,000. I'll just write 30 for $30,000. The marginal benefit is $30,000 higher than the actual price. The marginal benefit of that unit, the benefit that the market got out of it, is $30,000 higher than the price. The marginal benefit for the second unit is $20,000 higher than the price at which the product is being sold. The marginal benefit for this third unit, assuming this is 40, is $10,000. $10,000. Then they had to pay for it. Here, the consumer is willing to pay for it. And here's $10,000. And then this fourth consumer, let me write this down. What is the total consumer surplus? And another way of thinking about it is, what is the total excess of marginal benefit above and beyond the price paid? So how much surplus marginal benefit did they get if you take out the price paid? And over here, the total consumer surplus is going to be the $30,000, the 10,000 of cars here. We can't sell 1.1 cars. I guess if we're talking $60,000. So in this scenario, in that week, the consumers would get $60,000 more in benefit for them, in perceived benefit for them, than what they actually had to pay for it. And if you think about it, it's a little unideal for the seller because they were selling something at a lower price than maybe what they could have gotten from at least these first few consumers here. And that was because they just really, based on the model that we have here, they just had to set one price.
signed an agreement to reduce and progressively eliminate, that's the important part, eliminate barriers to trade and movement, barriers to trade and movement of factors of production among members. So there are a couple of things here we want to point out. That an agreement doesn't initially mean the complete elimination of all trade barriers. It just means a move to reduce and eventually eliminate. So these things could be phased in over a number of years. So just because a region announces a trading agreement, you have to look into the trading agreement and say, well, okay, what are the time frames on the reduction and elimination of those barriers? It doesn't just happen immediately. And it's barriers to trade and movement of factors of production. Sometimes you only have trade. Other times it also includes the factors of production. So let's look at sort of an ascending terminology in terms of regional trade agreements. At the very bottom we have the free trade agreement. Barriers to the flow of goods and services are eliminated. So we agree to reduce and progressively eliminate the barriers to the flow of goods and services. Notice that it doesn't include factors of production. It's just goods and services at this level. And each member maintains its own policy to non-members. So think about that for a minute. Each member maintains its own policy to non-members. So if you have 4 countries in a free trade agreement, and 3 of them don't like imports from China, but the 4th one says, I'm perfectly okay with that. They flow freely into that other one. They flow freely into a region that has a free trade agreement. So there's kind of a back door in there. So that's sort of the weakest type of agreement, but still an agreement, right? If you add to that common trade policy towards non-members, that closes that back door. Common trade policy, you have a customs union. If you then add to that the factors of production, free movement of the factors of production among members, you have a common market. So we go from a free trade agreement to a customs union to a common market. At a common market, you have a group of countries that have agreed to reduce or eliminate barriers. They have a common policy towards non-members, and factors of production can move around freely as well. If you add to the common market, if you add 2 more things, common economic institutions and the coordination of economic policy. By the way, if you have common economic institutions, you have an implicit promise of coordination of economic policy. You get an economic union. And if you add to that a common currency, it is a monetary union as well. So you could have an economic union that maintains its own currency. If it adopts a common currency, the economic union is also called a monetary union. This is the European Economic Union, the European Monetary Union. Whereas in North America, between Canada, US, and Mexico, there is a free trade agreement all at that other end. So there's sort of a hierarchy of regional trading blocks. So there's sort of a hierarchy of regional trading blocks. Continuing on with regional trading agreements, let's look at the words regional integration. And later in this reading, we're going to see that there is something called a World Trade Organization, which replaced the International Trade Organization. And we sort of wonder, well, why don't countries just become members of the WTO rather than having all of these agreements with all these other countries? Just go there. Well, to embark on a route of regional integration, it's quicker and easier than the WTO process. Quicker and easier because you got to get a whole bunch of countries to agree on absolutely everything. Here, it's just your friends to the party that you invite, right? Results in preferential treatment for members versus non-members, and this has its own unintended consequences or intended consequences. Have a look at the situation before any regional integration. Country E is a low-cost producer. We have A, B, C, and D. And C is a higher-cost producer. So what happens before any trade agreements is E is the preferential supplier to A, B, C, and D. I'm assuming E is, but there might be, C might have some trade barriers against D that says you can't sell in our country, but I'm assuming there are no trade barriers. They're all the same. A, B, C, D. E is the supplier of choice in this situation. A, B, C, and D get together now, and they form a regional trading bloc. And they have a common policy towards external countries that are non-members. So suddenly, there is a barrier to trade for E. which then makes C now the low-cost producer. Even though C is producing at a higher price than E, given the barrier to trade, C suddenly becomes a low-cost producer. So C is now supplying to A, B, and D, including itself. This is called trade diversion. A lower-cost import from a non-member, E, are replaced with higher-cost imports from member countries, C. So you could form a regional trading bloc, and some countries can find that, you know what, we used to buy product X at this price, now we got to pay this higher price simply because we're punishing this external member and rewarding this internal member. So that becomes one of those contentious issues in setting up these regional trading blocks. Is every country wants the best for itself. C really wants this to happen, but A, B, and D, there may be lobbyists and partners in here to the government saying, look, we're losing this guy over here. So this might be something where they agree, but this barrier might be phased in over a period of 5 or 10 years while they help C become more efficient so that the prices equalize. There might be that kind of step-in agreement so that E is not eliminated right away, but for the purposes of explaining what trade diversion is, that's what it looks like. So the other side of the coin of trade diversion is something called trade creation. And let's have a look at what that looks like before we look at the definition. So the other side is eliminated right away, but for the purposes of explaining what trade diversion is, that's what it looks like. So the other side of the coin of trade diversion is something called trade creation. And let's have a look at what that looks like before. Cost producer of A, B, and D. So C now supplies to B, to A, to D, and of course to itself. So C really benefits by the elimination of these barriers. The producers and employment in C benefit. The consumers see no difference because they were buying from C anyways. The consumers in A, B, and D are the clear winners because now they can buy at a lower price, but production and employment in A, B, and D is now lost to C. But we call it trade creation. Why? Because there was no trade going on here. Now there is trade. The replacement of higher cost domestic production for lower cost imports from member countries. Now, trade diversion is hard to figure out. It's hard to figure out who are the winners and losers. But with trade creation, it becomes very easy to see who the winners are in this example. C will be a clear winner. Now, can you think of something else between A, B, and D that was not here, that is here, that now is a winner, an industry that you can pick? Let's just pick the name of an industry. And you may say, but we don't have enough information to pick the name of an industry. Well, yes, you do. Look what's going on here. There's no movement of goods anywhere. Here, there's movement of goods. When there's movement of goods, they have to move. So transportation and shipping, whenever you have an increase in trade, you have an increase in transportation and shipping. So we don't have to worry about whether A, B, or D are going to have net gains to offset these net losses. We don't really have to care. We just have to identify who the winning country is going to be, plus transportation and shipping. And that's the way we sort of look at these trade agreements, into each country after and saying, where there is the potential for conflict, there is a higher level of motivation to make sure that doesn't happen. So there's attention paid to it right away. Greater member bargaining power with the rest of the world. Well, that stands to reason. If you're part of a bigger gang, your gang gets a little bit more respect on the street, right? Plus some spillover growth. And this does make sense. Earlier in this reading, I don't like the idea of knowledge spillovers because it lacks a mechanism. Stuff that doesn't spill out of my head onto the street for other people to pick up. But spillover growth, I get. If I'm, let's say, a supplier, a small company, and I'm a supplier to a big company who can get contracts all around the world, I will grow because they're growing. So that's that spillover growth. So I'm a small country to a regional trading agreement, along with some big strong companies in there, and suddenly they start diverting their purchases towards my small country. I'm going to grow because of it. So I get that. And with spillover growth comes a theory. I'm going to preface this by saying this is just a theory at this point. Convergence in living standards. This has not played out in the data, by the way, this idea of convergence in living standards. It's a theory. It's one of those theoretical benefits to international trade that neoclassical economists kind of buy into right away as a great argument why it's great for small countries, but it hasn't played out on the data. The argument goes like this. If you have a big country, A, with high labor costs, and a small country, B, with low labor costs, production will shift from the high-cost area to the low-cost area, thereby raising wages in the low-cost area. But it also has the effect of lowering high wages in the high-wage area because those jobs disappear. These people who were doing that job probably had special skills. They become structurally unemployed because the jobs they were trained for no longer exist. That's a tough thing to fix. Typically, they tend to get jobs at lower wages. So here's the deal with convergence. This is what's played out in the data. It is shown that high wage countries will suffer, that those sectors will suffer. However, the corporations are eager to enter these agreements because they have now access to low-cost wages to increase their margins. They don't necessarily reduce their price to the consumer, but they raise their margins. They keep that. So investors win, the corporation wins, but employment and production in the domestic country will lose, and the consumer is indifferent because they're not getting the lower price passed on to them. What about the low wages being raised in the smaller country? That typically doesn't happen either. That's it. The wages in the country are still just the wages. 3 years after these agreements, the average wage in the country is still the same as it was before the agreement. It's just more people have those wages, but the average wage still has not been raised. So this idea of convergence, let's keep in mind, even though we're learning this stuff, this is very neoclassical thinking. You don't have to agree with it. If you think there's something fundamentally flawed in all of the assumptions and all of the logic, you don't have to agree with it. You're free to do that. And as an analyst, you'll be a better analyst when you can look at the theory and say, well, that's the theory. But that's not reality. And if I'm going to be a great analyst with great calls, I want to think about what's going to happen in the real world, not in the neoclassical theoretical world, right? So, just you look at these things and you say, okay, well, I get the argument of convergence, but how come we don't see it in the data? That's the big question, right? Let's keep going. What about costs? Adjustment costs. Well, this is one of the adjustment costs, these high wages being lowered. That's something called adjustment costs. Some production and jobs will leave. Whenever two countries enter into a trading agreement, in both countries, some jobs will be created, and in both countries, some jobs and some production will leave. There are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. Now, it's not enough to walk over to the group of losers and say, look, you guys are going to lose, but the whole country's going to gain. Take one for the team. It's still a very tough thing to do. Some production and jobs leave. Now, the loss of those tends to be a one-time loss. It's not ongoing. The gains from trade tend to be ongoing, but the losses, the argument is, well, look, this is a temporary displacement. It's a one-time thing. However, the unemployment that happens in these sectors tend to be of longer duration than they otherwise would have been. So the losers really lose. The winners win incrementally every year, but the losers lose immediately and for a long period of time. So that's the big problem, right? Contagion. Problems in one country may spread to other members. In Canada, we say living beside the U.S. is like sleeping with an elephant. If the elephant rolls over, you get crushed. We also say things like, if the U.S. gets a cold, we get sick as well. Because as their economy goes, so does ours. They're the dog and we are the tail. So those are some of the costs of integrating too tightly with certain trading partners. Some of the challenges to the implementation of trading agreements, cultural or historical differences. And never underestimate how powerful these things actually are. We can sort of look at certain countries that we can almost agree right away would have a very difficult time creating a trade agreement. So let's say Israel with some of its neighbors, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine. You don't see that coming together very quickly. Japan and China, lots of history there. Lots of history and lots of not nice history there. So getting them to that point might also be challenging as well. Integration at an economic level will require some social and political integration. This is the big one. That tends to get a lot of backlash from more of the population, and not so much the political players, but that social integration. Especially if you get beyond the free trade agreement to an economic union where the factors of production can cross borders, that becomes a huge issue socially. If there was big cultural differences or some historical things from the past that just nobody wants to forget, that becomes a problem. Especially as you move towards what are called the common markets. Higher levels of integration may result in loss of independent economic control. It becomes more difficult to control relative prices between the two because you lose control of your currency, perhaps. The level of imports. Well, if you can't have a barrier against trade and imports start flooding your country and hurting your local production and employment, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? So when we look at challenges, we can sort of put it on a continuum from the free trade agreement all the way to the monetary union. Less challenging down here, simply because we don't have to worry about factors of production crossing the border. Every country maintains its own agreement to non-members, and it's you lose control, independent economic control. A country that perhaps needs to devalue and print money can no longer do that. That rewards trade. Maybe you have a 15 one of those organizations that suggests that no, you've got to go all the way, including removing all capital restrictions, because look at all the advantages of the free flow of capital. Investment can occur at a rate higher than domestic savings. That means faster growth if you have faster investment. You can achieve higher economic growth rate. Foreign direct investment may bring new technology, new skills, new processes, and induce domestic firms to become more efficient. Look, why wouldn't you want that to happen, right? By the way, foreign direct investment, the key word here is direct, as opposed to indirect. We're going to see later that some of the capital restrictions are typically for indirect investment. But foreign direct investment tends to be long-term, it's relatively fixed, and the key word is direct. In other words, foreign money comes into the country and it builds a factory, it builds a plant, it does something. It does something real. It's directly investing in the country. Indirect investment is money coming in, buying stocks and bonds. Okay, so as long as we understand the difference. So foreign direct investment has a whole bunch of benefits as well. However, there are disadvantages. If the investment is short-term in nature, that is indirect investing, stocks, bonds, etc., we refer to that as hot money, it may inflate the local currency so that you have an overvaluation of the local currency, which makes imports really cheap but kills its export sector. So goods and services can come flowing into the country from outside, and that really can do a number on domestic employment and domestic production simply because of the currency. You've gotten rid of all the tariffs, you're allowing capital in, it surges into your country, creates an overvalued currency where imports flow in nicely, because this country's currency is so overvalued it can buy everything cheaply, but nothing's leaving, too expensive, right? Here's the problem. When it's over, and it's going to be over, it's always over. It never just continues. When it's over, when hot money leaves, it leaves fast and things just crash. That's called capital flight. and you get value destruction. Real estate drops way beyond what it should drop because most of it was held up with this hot money. Equity markets really get wiped out, which means the local population that were holding stocks in their retirement funds take a huge hit. They had it nice when all this money came flooding in, but when it leaves, it leaves. Currency devaluation. If money running into the country can create an overvalued currency, money leaving can drop a currency. And if that country relies on imports for a lot of its, let's say, energy and food products, you're getting an inflation engine, which could destroy the country on the way out. So you can destroy the country on the way in with overvaluation of its currency, wiping out its production and employment in key production sectors, and you can hurt the country on the way out with creating a completely devalued currency, which sparks inflation at a rapid pace. So this down here, these disadvantages, a country looks at that and says, that, we want to avoid that. Sure, this is nice to have up here, but this is worse than this is nice. We want to avoid that, and that's why capital restrictions still play a big role. So what are the common reasons why a country would have capital restrictions in place? Well, protect domestic industries, as we've already discussed. When money comes in and could potentially overvalue a currency, it would hurt its exports. Protect domestic industries, protect domestic ownership. So that a country doesn't want all of its publicly traded corporations owned primarily by foreign investors. So protect domestic ownership, minimize the export of profit, and control the currency value. So these are all good. Nobody could argue with that. No country wants to lose control of its currency. Minimizing the export of profit is keeping saving within the country. Preserving domestic ownership, protect domestic industries. These are all great political goals to aspire to. Also, if an economy has a fixed rate currency, that means they have a peg, they're pegging their currency to something else, you will most likely need capital restrictions. If you have a fixed rate currency, if you have a peg and you have the free flow of capital, this becomes almost impossible to hold. That if you're going to hold the peg, it's not a matter of it would be nice to have these capital restrictions because of this, it's almost a necessity. Limits on inflows and outflows will make it easier to hold the peg. Limits on inflows and outflows. An inflow will push up a currency, an outflow will push down a currency. So if you've got a period where inflows overwhelm outflows and you've got to hold that peg, that requires a lot of work on the central bank's part and a lot of cash to make happen. And if you have a bunch of outflows that overwhelm the inflows, holding that peg is going to become even harder, and there'll come a point where you will fail. And history has a bunch of examples where central banks tried to hold a value for a certain period of time and simply just failed. It's just inevitable that you're going to fail because it requires so much capital. So when you control this, when you say, okay, you know what, if inflows and outflows are going to cause the problem, let's just get rid of that. Let's just put a big restriction on that so that we can hold the peg. Now, interest rates in your economy can be used to steer the economy itself and not the exchange rate. So you don't have to use the interest rate to continue to maintain the peg, because to maintain the peg might require a move in the interest rate that would do nothing than make a bad economy even worse. So now you free up the interest rate to do the job it's supposed to do, which is steer the domestic economy. So the capital restriction is a way to avoid the problem before the problem even happens. So how do we restrict the flow of capital? Well, there could be prohibition, just outright elimination. No money can come into my country to buy anything on my stock exchanges, period. So it could be a statement like that. Taxes, in and out. Price controls, whether they be special taxes on investment returns or transaction taxes. These taxes, by the way, are meant to be punitive. They're not meant to be fair. The tax is not put in place to say, well, what's a fair amount that the government should get based on the revenue generated? They're meant to be punitive. They're saying, look, if you're going to come in, you're going to cause a problem, you're going to pay for your own cleanup, this is what we want, period. So we can't look at these taxes and say it's an unfair tax system. Yes, it's exactly unfair. That's the point. It's a capital restriction, so it should be a bad tax. And these special taxes on investment returns could be something as simple as withholdings. So for instance, I as a Canadian, if I buy a European stock or an American stock and it pays dividends, I don't get the full dividend. There's a certain amount that's withheld in the country before it even leaves, before it even gets to me. There's withholding. Also, loss of special allowances. For instance, Canada says, hey, you're free to invest anywhere in the world you want. We won't restrict the outflow of capital, but here's the deal. If you earn a capital gain on a non-Canadian asset, that's not a capital gain. You don't qualify for the capital gains exemption. You must claim it as all income and pay the highest tax rate on it. Same with dividends. You earn a non-Canadian dividend, you don't get that tax credit. You must claim it as pure income at the top of your income. So what happens for Canadians, we look at that and we say, you know what, the after-tax cost of owning an equity outside of the country doesn't make a lot of sense, so you end up buying Canadian equities for the Canadian dividends and the Canadian capital gains because you end up in a much lower after-tax position. So that is what's called it's not a special tax on the investment returns earned somewhere else, but it's the lack of the special tax credits earned on income somewhere else, which is a form of saying, here's how we can control the outflow of our citizens' saving or our citizens' investment and encourage local investment. It is a form of capital restriction without actually being capital restriction. It's masquerading as, hey, listen, there's a great benefit to invest in Canada. We're not going to punish you if you invest anywhere else, but we're not going to reward you. The lack of the reward is the punishment, if you follow that logic. Quantity controls, which is a small relaxation on prohibition. So there might be a restriction on short-term investment, but no restriction on direct investment, so that if you wanted to build a factory or a plant, you could go ahead. There might be restrictions on the housing market where you cannot, outside investors to the country cannot come in and buy up housing. Can't do it because that can really push a housing market to the point of unaffordability, right? So there could be some relaxations. Typically, quantity controls may come in the form of ownership percentages, where no foreigner can own more than collectively maybe 20% of any company or 49%, whatever the case is, but there could be some quantity controls. The problem with all of this is it's costly to administer and it's costly to monitor. It is just an extra layer of costs to try to keep this in order. But think about it for a minute. If it's costly to administer and monitor, that means that the people who are administering and monitoring it are receiving an income, and it's creating employment, right? So that could be the other side of that argument. And it may have some long-term costs, isolation from global capital markets. You get into a position where you have a history of blocking capital flow in and out of your country. Eventually, if you actually need the global capital markets, they might be saying, well, you know what, you haven't been very nice to us, so here's your interest rate, LIBOR plus 3,000. Part of the chapter because it just seems so confusing. It doesn't seem very straightforward. So I'm going to give it to you in the most straightforward way. And I'm going to suggest that there's a lot of stuff that you don't really need to know. That it's actually kind of easier to get into your head. If you're going to be an economist at the international level, then this is your playground. You better be able to count all the grains of sand. But if you're just walking through, knowing a map of the terrain is good enough, right? So let's go. Balance of payments is kind of like, the best way to describe it is like accounting. There's a double entry system in accounting, and there is an identity, a balance of payments identity. So let's just get to what it is, nice and simple. We have debits and we have credits. Every debit entry requires a credit entry. And all debit and credit entries can be broken down in just 3 categories. An increase in real assets is a debit, an increase in financial assets, or a decrease in financial liabilities. Full stop. If you can remember that the debit side of the balance of payments is increases in assets. Here's our 2 assets of this. We have different accounts. Now you may say, well, this is where it gets complicated. Well, no, it doesn't. Think about accounting. And we got real assets and financial assets. Well, we have accounts there, right? We have cash, you have inventory, accounts receivable, short-term investments, property, plant, and equipment, depreciation. Those are the accounts that are debits. Well, we have accounts as well. But we only have 3. Accounting has hundreds of accounts. We only have 3. So think about how much easier that just got. We have a current account, which measures the flow of goods and services. There's our exports and imports, right? Measures the flow of goods and services. And there's some other little details in there, but let's just high-level picture and we'll drill down. Measures the flow of goods and services. We have a capital account. Measures the transfer of capital. That makes a lot of sense. The capital account should measure the transfer of capital. And we have a financial account, records investment flows. And I've labeled them 1, 2, and 3. Here's the balance of payment identity. 1 must equal 2 plus 3. Remember the balance sheet identity? The balance sheet identity said that assets must equal liabilities plus owner's equity. Well, the balance of payments identity says the current account must equal the capital account plus the financial account. More specifically, let me just get a little bit more specific here. The absolute value of 1 will equal the absolute value of 2 plus 3. The absolute value of 1 will equal the absolute value of 2 plus 3. Now, if we have this relationship, think about double entry. If you have a current account debit, you must either have a current account credit or either a capital or a financial account credit. So you can have a debit or credit within one, but if they're different, they must come from either a current account and a capital and financial account, much like an asset and liability side. So if you understand accounting at the assets equal liability plus owner's equity level, you understand a balance of payments at the current account and capital in detail. I hope this helped. An entry to show that it gave it away, it just gets nothing for it. It's just a complete loss, right? All commodities and manufactured goods, bought, sold, and given away. Services, things like tourism, transportation, engineering, business services, fees on patents, copyrights, software, books, movies. So when a American-made movie travels the world, Star Wars, right, is going to create billions of dollars. Well, that's considered part of the current account and under services. Merchandise, trade, services, income receipts, dividend and interest income. That's part of the current account. Why do we think about it that way? Well, it's because dividends and incomes are a payment on the capital that you lent out or the capital that you gave away. In other words, the capital provided a service and the dividends and interest are the payment on that service. That's the argument. You just got to remember that that's the argument. And unilateral transfers, one-way transfer of assets. Well, that's what unilateral means, right? Foreign direct aid, income earned from abroad, sent back home. So I'm working in another country, I'm making a paycheck, I send that money back home. That's all part of the current account. So there's our current account. The big thing in the current account is, keep in mind, it's merchandise, trade, and services. In fact, this is so large in the current account. If you took it as a percentage of the current account, you could ignore 3 and 4 because they're so small compared to the size of 1 and 2 that it's almost the same number. so that the current account, when we get to some of the identities that we can get to later on, when we do some algebra with some letters, we'll find that the current account is a great proxy for our trade balance, and that's it. We can ignore 3 and 4 when we get to that. This is the big thing in the current account. If you can remember, hey, goods and services. There we go, goods and services. Beautiful. The capital account. 2 categories in here: capital transfers and the sale and purchase of non-produced, non-financial assets. You may say, what the hell could that be? We'll get to it. A capital transfer, debt forgiveness, migrants transfers. So when somebody enters the country, they enter the country with a whole bunch of, unless they're penniless coming across that border, they're going to come across with something, right? They're going to bring some cash in with them, some wealth in with them. Gifts, inheritance taxes, death duties, transfer of funds linked to the sale or purchase of fixed assets. These are all capital transfers. Why do we call it transfers? Because capital was sitting in one place and it was simply transferred to another place. For instance, I'm living in Canada. I'll be moving to another country very shortly. So everything that I own, all the wealth that I have, will transfer to that country. Well, it would be recorded in the capital account. I'm not doing anything other than just bringing it with me, right? Sale and purchase of non-produced, non-financial assets. So think about your airwaves. That's called spectrum. Well, it's non-produced. Nobody produced the spectrum. It's just there. It's a non-financial asset. There we go. We're starting to see what the sale and purchase of these things are. Rights to natural resources, including natural resources, the air you have on top of you, the spectrum. Rights to natural resources, sale and purchase of intangible assets, all in the capital account. So let's look at the financial account now, and that is broken down into 2 sectors: financial assets abroad, official reserve accounts of our central bank; government assets, money they have around the world; and private assets, money we have in other countries, things like gold, forex, securities. Second one is foreign-owned financial assets within our country, or within the country that's measuring their balance of payments. These can be broken down into official assets like bonds, stocks, mortgage-backed securities. These are securities you buy and own, and other foreign assets that don't really have an official status to them. A direct investment, for example, foreign liabilities, and we'll see what that means shortly. So let's look at some examples of accounting entries for balance of payments, and we'll see it's really not that difficult. So let's take our first example here. In our first example, we are going to sell $50 million worth of goods to another country. Our exports are $50 million, and we're going to get paid in 90 days, so we don't have the money right away. Included in this $50 million is $1 million in transportation costs to get it there. So what are we doing? Well, we have goods and services. We have goods and services, but what are we creating? We're creating a financial asset. What's the financial asset? Well, it's money people owe us. It's a foreign liability for the other country, which means it's an asset for us. So our financial account will go up by 50 million. Our current account will go down by 50 million. Goods of 49 million, services of $1 million. To get it clear in your head what's going on here, think about it like this. Our accounts receivable is going up by 50 million and our inventory is going down by 50 million, right? So we have remember our identity is that the current account equals the sum of the capital account plus the financial account. And does it? Yes, it does. We have a current account here of 50 million, and on the other side of the equation, the other 50 million. So there's our double entry, there's our balance, it balances. And you can think of it about it in terms, well, we sold $50 million worth of goods. If we were a company, how would we record that? We'd record it as an accounts receivable and as a sale of inventory. It just so happens that the inventory account is our current account and our accounts receivable account is our financial account. Just different names, same idea. So there's an example of an export. Well, we did exports, let's do imports. Let's say we're going to import $45 million worth of something on terms of 90 days as well. Well, if an export was a credit entry for the current account, an import must be a debit entry for the current account. And if an accounts receivable was a debit entry in the financial account, an accounts payable must be a credit entry in the financial account. So we can think of this as, well, we bought something we're importing, so our inventory account went up, and our accounts payable went up because we have terms of 90 days. So we have our current account and our financial account. Isn't that nice? We're going to buy $100 million in bonds from a foreign country, but it's going to be the same currency just to make it simple. All right, so it's the same currency. So if we're doing that, chances are we're buying a euro bond, right? $100 million in bonds from a foreign country. So what's going to happen here? Well, our financial account will increase by 100 million, and our financial account will decrease by 100 million. So it's just an offsetting transaction. And if we're wondering how this works on balance sheet, if we're doing regular accounting, how could you possibly have this? Well, think about it this way. Let's say you bought some bonds, a company bought some bonds, puts its cash in bonds. What's going to happen? Its investment account is going to increase, and cash is going to decrease, right? So you can think about it that way. This next one is a little bit tricky to follow, so I'm going to walk you through it nice and easy. The example in the book gives an example of residents in Switzerland holding on to euros, and they don't want to hold on to euros anymore. They want Swiss francs. And we're going to see the role that the central bank plays in it, because if nobody steps in, what happens is the conversion of those euros to Swiss francs will actually move the currency, and the central bank may not want that. So this is how this typically would work. So we have, within the country, 20 million euros being held by citizens. Typically what they do, anybody who's exchanged currency, you go to your local bank, and you exchange it for your local currency, which is Swiss francs. So there you go. But now the bank is sitting on all of these euros, and it doesn't want that, so it's going to sell the euros in the open market to get its Swiss francs back. The exchange that it charges on the euro to the Swiss francs will more than cover its margin when it sells euro, and it'll make a spread. It's in the business of making money, so that's what it's going to do. The problem is, if we do it this way, it will affect, what the currency will it affect? It's going to affect the euro.swiss pair, eur.chf pair. And the central bank may not want that to happen. So instead, let's say that so, instead, this is what happens. The Swiss National Bank will say to all the local banks, listen, you bring your currency to me, and you give me the euros, I'll buy the euros from you. So it buys euro, and it'll replace with Swiss. So from the bank's perspective, that's what they wanted. They got Swiss francs back in the bank. They're good. The Swiss National Bank is now holding on to these euros. It does not want to sell these euros in the open market. It doesn't want to affect the currency. So what it will do is it will find a German bank. It'll go to Germany and it'll say, hey, you know what? We hold reserve accounts in other countries. So what we're going to do is we're going to deposit our 20 million euros in this German bank. So from Switzerland's perspective, they have an asset outside of the country. From Germany's perspective, they have a liability within the country. A foreign-owned asset within the country is Germany's liability. It's Switzerland's asset, right? So it deposits rather than sells. And this is referred to as foreign reserves. So now we know how we get foreign reserves, right? So how do we record this transaction? How would this look? Well, what's going to happen is our financial account is going to go up by 20 million. Our financial account is going to go up by 20 million because it falls in one of the two categories of what are in financial accounts. This is not a transfer of capital. We're not just sending money over there and that's it. The Swiss National Bank is not moving to Germany. The Swiss National Bank is depositing money there, but it's saying, hey, by the way, Germany, that's our money. We want it back at some point. So the capital wasn't transferred in, it was deposited. So that's why it's in the financial account. Well, we have a financial account of 20 million, but we also have an offsetting transaction in the financial account of 20 million. And in terms of accounting, how do we get that? If we were looking at this from a corporation's point of view, how would that look? Is from Germany's perspective, because this is the example in the book it says that we have to write this up from Germany's perspective. So we have to walk all the way through Switzerland to see what it looks like in Germany. From Germany's perspective, this is a liability, but Germany did receive some cash. However, it has a short-term liability. So from a German All right, let's get into some of the algebra here. You'll recall from earlier in macro, we had our basic macroeconomic formula for the expenditure approach, y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m, and this was net exports. Well, when I talked about the current account, I said that the trade in goods and services are so large a part of the current account that we can pretty much just eliminate the other two categories and still be fairly close to what the original number was. So for x minus m, this tends to equal the current account balance. So if we have a trade surplus, that will be reflected in our current account. If we have a trade deficit, it will actually be reflected in the current account. So that the current account actually measures the size and direction of our international borrowing or lending. If we have a trade surplus, it means we must have lent to other countries. If we have a trade deficit, we must have borrowed from other countries. That's the conclusion of the balance of payments process, is that whatever that number is, it's either we're engaging in lending or engaging in borrowing. And now we can say something about those things. So remember the identity I gave earlier, the absolute value of the current account equals the absolute value of the capital and financial account. Hence the term balance of payments, because they have to balance. So let's just do a little bit of moving around here. Y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m. But here we said that it equals the current account balance. So we can just move x minus m to the other side, rewrite this as x minus m equals y minus c minus I minus g. You'll see that all I did was just rearrange here. Or we'll just substitute the current account in for x minus m now. We'll put the current account in equals y minus, and then we'll just collect the other terms in brackets, c plus I plus g. So you can see how we got from y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m to the current account equals y minus c plus I plus g. That's very simple, right? If our current account is less than 0, then we must be borrowing from abroad. We must be borrowing from abroad. If it is greater than 0, by very definition of the double entry that we went through, and by the definition of this identity, we must be lending abroad. It's not that maybe we will or won't. No, we must be lending abroad because this identity must hold. So we must be lending abroad, or we must be borrowing, depending on where that is. Well, because of that, we can say some interesting things in terms of savings and disposable income. So let's get to that. Okay, so I've got everything sort of written out on the screen here, and I know it looks complicated. And before we start, I just want to say one thing about what we're about to do here. Is I want you to understand that what we're doing is a very academic exercise. In fact, there's a lot of academics who would call this nothing more than academic masturbation. That it doesn't necessarily mean that the world is this neat and tidy. It just means that the economic models that academics like to use are neat and tidy, and that's why they like to use it. But don't get so trapped into the precision of it that we tend to want to transport that precision to the real world. The real world is far messier than this. This is just a way of structuring our thinking so we can say some things in some very broad terms, but it doesn't mean that it's specific. And I'll clear that up when we get to the bottom of the screen here in the blue writing. I'll clear it up there. But you'll recall that disposable income was nothing more than national income minus whatever taxes we pay plus whatever transfer payments we receive. So it's y minus t plus r gives us disposable income. And we know that our disposable income is the sum of our consumption and our savings, our marginal propensity to consume. And of course, the marginal propensity to save is 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So we have these little identities. Well, we can rearrange YD, disposable income equals C plus savings, into C equals a disposable income minus savings. That's all we've done here is we've just rearranged this. Equals Y minus T plus R minus SP. Now you're probably wondering, well, how did you get from here to here? Well, if YD equals this, YD minus none, YD equals this SP. I'm taking some reading a book that makes all we did. So now we can say we can take out this middle part and just jump right to C equals Y minus TR equals SP. So this next one that we have, remember, this is equal to Y equals all of this. We can just substitute this into C. That's what we're going to do up here. Is we're just going to take all of this because C equals this, but here, and since we've already, we're just going to substitute anybody. I'm going to get like terms, y minus y, that disappears. SP is a positive, T is a positive, and then I'm going to take all my negatives and put them together. So I bring my positives to the front, my negatives to the back. And then I'm just going to rearrange a bit so that it's nice and easy to figure out SP minus I plus, and then I'll put in brackets, there's my T term, my R and G. For payments, well, that's either your minus G, taxes, minus government spending, minus all the transfer payments. Well, that's either your government surplus. That's government savings, SG. So we can take this whole term out now and just put SG in. So CA, we started with CA equaling all that. CA equals SP minus I plus SG. So what are we saying? It's our current account balance equals private savings less investment, whatever private savings went into investment, plus government savings. And from this here, we can say quite a few things. So let's rearrange the terms here. Let's bring investment over to this side and isolate just savings on this side. So what are we saying over here? We have our savings over here. This is private savings and government savings. That's total domestic savings, right? Can be used to finance domestic investment, or the current account balance. So if our current account balance is less than 0, domestic investment can be greater than the sum of our domestic savings. That's what that's saying. Remember when we started with balance with the international trade, one of the benefits we got to from international trade is it allows the level of our investment to be greater than the level of our savings. Well, here it is drawn out in more of a proof. If CA is less than 0, domestic investment can be greater than SP plus SG. Try it out. Let's say that this is negative 10, and let's say this is 20. It must equal SP plus SG, so negative 10 plus 20 is positive 10, right? Notice that our domestic savings is only 10, but our investment is 20. See how that works? Is because our domestic investment can be greater. We can borrow from abroad, and we have greater investment. So there's one of the conclusions. So why did we go through all of this? Is so that we can actually not just make a statement, but see that, okay, the model suggests that, and whether we agree with it or not is a different thing. Whether it's played out in the data is a different thing or not. But there we go. There's a statement we can make. Let's rearrange this a little bit more and see if we can say something else interesting. Private savings equal all of this. So private savings can be used for domestic investment. Private savings can also be used for investment in the current account. And it can also be used for any increase or decrease, for any excess or decrease in government debt. We can either buy bonds or sell bonds, right? So we can see that private savings has a number of places where it can go. So if we have lower levels of private savings, we know that we're going to have to make it up somewhere else. If we have high levels of private savings, we can relax in other places. And finally, what does the last thing say? Our current account is equal to our domestic savings less our investment. Or investment may be too high. The country could be embarking as just, this is where all of this gymnastics up here, this mental gymnastics becomes important, because we can say these things. So focus on the conclusions of what we can say, and don't get bogged down so much in how did you get from here to here, from here to here. Just understand that these are the conclusions that we can say in a very broad sense, without having to get so precise saying the formula says this, so it must work. That's where neoclassical economists fall into their trap of these blinders on by saying the formula says this, so it's got to work. I don't even need to look at the data. That's going to be the conclusion.
Hey Internet, this is Jacob Clifford. Welcome to ACDC Econ. Congratulations on finishing your macroeconomics class. You are now done.
Here's the conquering hero.
You understand everything you can, even though there's a lot of big pieces missing. It's kind of like Impressionism. You can definitely see what's going on, but the details are kind of blurry and kind of But at this stage of the game, you understand there's some key graphs that you have to know for your final exam or for the AP test. And more importantly, you should be able to see how they're connected to each other. And that is what we're going to do in this video. Gap, full employment, or inflationary gap. Easy, you got it. But that graph also connects to the production possibilities curve that shows the same concept. Again, the economy can be at one of three places, which can also be shown on aggregate demand and supply, right? Shifting that supply and demand curve around show you that you can have a recessionary gap, full employment, or an inflationary gap. And we're not done. There's more. There's also the Phillips curve, which shows the same concepts. Recessionary gap, full employment, inflationary gap. So 4 graphs, 3 you probably need for your test, the business cycle not so much, all show the same concept. Where is the economy? Then you learn the money market graph. Now this doesn't show you where the economy is, but it does show you how interest rates affect the economy. So monetary policy, increase in the money supply, would decrease nominal interest rates. Lower nominal interest rates would increase investment. More investment means more aggregate demand, right? An increase in consumer spending and investment, that's expansionary monetary policy. And since we're here, a decrease in the money supply would increase interest rates, which would decrease investment, and lower investment means lower aggregate demand, decrease in consumer spending and investment spending. That is contractionary monetary policy. Okay, we got it. You can also connect the money market graph to the loanable funds market. I actually made a whole nother video on that. Go ahead and watch it. It talks about all the stuff in details, why one's the nominal interest rate and why the other one is the real interest rate. So go watch that for the details. But what about the last graph, the foreign exchange market graph? That's not really connected to any of the others, except it is. Take a look at this. This shows the loanable funds market, which sets the real interest rate and its effect on net capital outflow. Remember, this is connected to the balance of payments and the financial account. This is the idea of foreigners buying financial assets in another country. So what determines if foreigners buy our assets or if we buy their assets? Well, the real interest rate. So right here at 0, that means there's no deficit or surplus in the financial account. But if the interest rate goes up, a higher interest rate will lead to less outflow. Less outflow means more inflow, right? Right? Higher interest rate would mean more people want to lend in your country, which totally makes sense. If the United States had a higher real interest rate, then foreigners would want to buy American bonds so they get that higher rate of return. But if the real interest rate in the United States was lower, then foreigners would take their money out and more Americans would buy other countries' higher interest rate assets. So that means there's an increase in outflow from the United States. Did that make any sense? Does that make sense? Now that quantity of money coming in or going out of your country determines the amount of money that's available to be exchanged in the foreign exchange markets. So that helps determine the value of your currency. That's the graph down there. Right now you're probably thinking, wait a second. The foreign exchange market does not have a vertical supply curve. It has an upward sloping supply curve. And you're totally right, 100%. But in this case, we're just looking at the money that's available in the foreign exchange market that's there from people who are buying and selling assets from different countries. Just the money that's available based on people's willingness to borrow and lend in different countries based on the real interest rate. Don't freak out. It'll make more sense when I show you a shift on these 3 graphs. So let's assume there's an increase in investment and people want to borrow more because the economy is doing well in the United States. So the demand goes up for loanable funds, which leads to a higher real interest rate. Now that real interest rate would attract more foreigners, foreign investment into the United States. In other words, the outflow would decrease. So that's shown on that graph right there. It's showing you that foreigners are putting more money in the United States to get that higher rate of return. But it's also showing you that Americans are deciding to lend less in other countries, right? They're keeping their money inside the United States. That means there's less dollars available in the foreign exchange, which is shown on that bottom graph. So you can think of that vertical curve as a supply curve for the currency available in the foreign exchange. There's less dollars available because Americans are keeping it in their own country. That would lead to an increase in the value of dollars or appreciation. Again, this is nothing new. You've learned this back in Unit 5, but the reason why I'm showing you this is because I want to connect the loanable funds market graph to the foreign exchange market graph and show you how those things are connected. And maybe, hopefully, solidify things in your brain.
Come over here, big group hug. Group hug.
Okay, let's do that again, except this time let's look at a decrease in the real interest rate. So let's assume that in the United States there's an increase in savings and Americans decide to save more. So the supply of loanable funds shifts to the right, decreasing the real interest rate. Now, what happens to net capital outflow? Americans don't want to buy American assets. They want to go buy foreign assets to get that higher rate of return. And foreigners don't want to buy American assets either. They want to keep their money in their own countries and get that higher rate of return in their own countries. The net capital outflow will increase, and the United States will move towards a financial account deficit. And with all the funds and how the real interest rate affects the financial account and how the financial account affects
I don't know if this is a date or not. Maybe we're just being friendly and grabbing drinks just like you do with your friends, right? Yeah, I mean, we are comparing hand sizes and we are holding hands and she did just propose, but it could just be a friendly thing, right?
Can't keep my hands to myself. I mean, I could, but why would I want to? The all-girl party, clothing optional.
Tracy with the Honda? Shit. Well, oops, baby, fuck up on your bitch like oopsie daisy. Never knew that was your boo, baby. Hit her 5 times in the coupe, Mercedes, whoopsie daisy. Oops.
Hit on the gas and zoom, zoom. Get out the fast lane, boom, boom.
Called her a hoe because she said nobody you let never reciprocate.
I come to your city, I sneak in your chimney, I tickle her kidney, and then I watch Disney. I love me some hentai.
Don't know why. Now tell me who's the
我真的奉劝各位铲屎官，你们平时在家的时候，能不能多注意观察小猫咪的精神状态啊？就比如这个小猫咪，它现在一看就是想要被亲亲啦，这么可。
Dreaming 95 minutes ago. So you haven't started even like just 2 hours. you can take the short break, like 10 minutes short break.为什么你的live streaming 还真的有 view 啊？有73个 view。哦，神奇！你自己能够点73次啊？就你的sleeping view 的话，就有73个。好吧。为什么会有人会点进去看？然后 No Time to Study 有3个 view，No Time to Study 有2个 view，还有现在有1个在 watching， 那是我。
但海欣咧，佢真係將呢個退完先咧，冇人係直剪到咗呢個我哋嗰個聽嘅係10開間應該得唔得？咁假如傾，因為佢咁嘅地方嚟㗎，先係。哎呀，中間係咩啊？因為一個希，或者你話即係你靚啲嘅。
好 ，OK，Study hard。Okay, bye.
they do this mostly to prevent the spread of a crisis. That if there's a crisis because of some issue with the balance of payments, the IMF is ready to step in. Are not for profit. Again, still sounds kind of nice. Well, they're not in it for the money. They look at the names, bank for ratings, and have to borrow at real. But here are the policies that'll organization. So we have the IMF, the World Bank. And the W committee for the PO benefit have to look when you get there. And later in this reading, we're going to see that there is something called a world sector. Production and employment do increase as a result. Prices go up, demand. UK can only produce 8, so India has an. Where I jiggle my pen, it will always draw and a higher consumption activity. There you go. And he had certain assumptions to his model. Labor is the only variable factor input. The only variable factor, not the only factor input, the only variable factor input. And of course, technology has to vary across countries. So, in a very simplified manner, let's look at his argument. Let's look at the number of hours to make either product X or product Y, and we have country A and country B. So if his argument was, look, if you look at country A and the amount of time to make product X, and country B, the amount of time to make product X, it's not going to be the same. They're going to be different. If in country A, the amount of time, the amount of hours required to make product X is more than it is in country B, B makes X.
what does x to the y equal y to the x actually mean? The left-hand side means x multiplied y times. The right-hand side means y multiplied x times. So some multiple of x is the same as some multiple of y. Or to make things even a little bit more simple, y is some multiple of x. What this means is we can make a substitution y equals mx, meaning just that y is a multiple of x. And we can go ahead and substitute this into our equation. So x is now raised to the mx, and this equals mx to the power of x. This is nice because now the x is in both exponents, and we can remove it by raising both sides to the 1 over x power. Assuming, of course, x isn't 0. Now we can go ahead and just solve for x. Maybe just divide both sides by x, and apply your properties of exponents. X to the m minus 1 equals m. And we can do a very similar trick like before to isolate x, just raise both sides to the 1 over m minus 1 power. We'll just have x on the left, which equals m to the power of 1 over m minus 1. Also, this very quickly gives us y, since y was mx, so y is m times m to the power of 1 over m minus 1.
we're about to start the final reading in this series, currency exchange. And before we get going, what I'd like you to try to do to get a little bit more familiar with this, and this is actually a very fun thing. I'm on fxcm.com, and you notice when you get there, this little window pops up. So if you're Canadian, you're going to want to read this little window, and it gives you a link to fxcm.ca. But for everyone else, this is a free, you just got to fill in a bit of information here. This gives you a 30-day free trading demo. You can trade live. You're trading the live quotes of Forex. Live buy and sell prices, 50,000 of virtual money, trade online 24 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's how long the currency markets are open. And you'll start to get a nice intuitive feel for the economic calendar. And the economic calendar, you'll see I have it up here for the week coming up, December 27th, gives you every country and the economic report that is coming out. So we see a whole bunch for Japan. And if you notice the time, 1850, this is New York time, of course. So 1850 New York time is 8 o'clock at night in Japan. And you just keep going down. And what you want to try to do, and this is fun, this is really fun, is take your currency, the currency trading that you're going to do, the fake trading that you're going to do, and match it up with some of these economic reports and take a position in front of the report. Here's why. Because when these reports come out, especially the ones that are medium, the ones that are low, who cares? But medium, and you might, if we scroll down, we might find one. Here it is, China Manufacturing PMI. It's a high relevance. In other words, it has a high impact on currencies. What you'll find is that when these reports come out, the currencies tend to move immediately. And you get to see the effect from the economic report right through to the foreign exchange reaction. So I encourage you to give that a try. To download FXCM, and you can download it for your iPad as well, and match it up with the economic calendar and see what happens. And I'll tell you, here's what's going to happen over 30 days is you're going to learn more about the flow of information from economic events to currencies to the actual markets themselves. By actually immersing yourself in this, you're going to learn this a lot better. And you know what? It's fun. It's actually kind of fun. All right, let's get on with our chapter, and let's get that out of the way. All right, we're beginning the reading on currency exchange rates, and currencies can be a little bit tricky. So I'm going to go slow over the first few screens just to make sure that you have the terminology right and the notation right, because if you don't get that, you can get lost very quickly trying to figure out, hang on a second, what's changing? Which one's going up? Which one's going down? So let's have a look at what we have in the top corner here. We have a bunch of 3-letter tickers. If they were stocks, you would think, well, what stocks are these, right? All currencies have 3 letters and can be denoted by 3 letters. The US dollar, the euro, the pound, the yen, the Canadian, the Australian dollar, New Zealand, Norwegian krona, the Swedish krona, Swiss franc, the ruble, the Singapore dollar, and there are many others. So that denotes a specific currency. When we talk about exchange rates, it has to be 2, because if you're talking about the Canadian exchange rate, well, with what other currency? What you can exchange Canadian for US dollars, for pounds, for euros, for yen, for pesos, which one? So exchange rates are quoted in pairs, and that's what can make it tricky sometimes, because if we quote the US dollar in terms of euro, it's not the same as quoting euros in terms of US dollars. It's a different rate. There's a relationship, but it's different. So the order of the pair matters. So let's just break one of these down first. We'll learn how to read one of these quotes, and then we'll go to the notation used in the book, which is just a ratio. But first, if we can read this, it'll make this a lot easier to make sense of. How these are read is the first of the pair is always 1. So 1 euro buys this much US. Another way to say it is to get a euro, if you have US dollars, you need to pay 109.50 US to get 1 euro. If you have 1 euro will get you 1.095 US. This is called the base. This first one here is called the base. In fact, that's the base right there. That's the base. That's the base. The first of the pair is the base. The second of the pair is the price. Is the price currency. So let's see if we can't read this one. This is easy. 1 US dollar buys 1.3925 Canadian. Or you need 1.3925 Canadian to buy 1 US dollar. That's nice and simple, right? If they're expressed in terms of a ratio A to B, a little bit different. The base makes sense. The base is where? In the basement, right? It's in the denominator. Just think about it that way. Base is the first part of basement. The basement is down here. So the base, the euro, here it's euro.us. This would be US over euro. So you wouldn't think, well, it's euro over US because euro's first. This comes to the bottom. That goes to the top. So the price currency is on the top. The base is on the bottom. And it makes sense, right? How else do we get, in a ratio, how else do we get 1.0950? If the base is always 1, then the numerator is 1.0950, right? So 1 euro buys this much US. The base buys this much. That's the price of the numerator. So in this one here, here's the base. It's a US dollar. There's the numerator, Canadian. That's the price of the numerator. 1 US dollar buys 1.3925 Canadian. Or to say it another way you want to read this. So the euro.us is the same as US over euro. Here's our base. Bought fewer US dollars. So in this situation here, the exchange rate went down that means our price currency is appreciating, or we could easily say that the euro has depreciated. They mean the same thing. So when we look at this exchange rate, 1 euro was buying 109.5 US. Now 1 euro is only buying 109 US. We're buying fewer US dollars with our euro. So we can say the euro has depreciated against the US dollar, or we could say the US dollar has appreciated against the euro. They mean the same thing. All right, let's move on to distinguish between nominal and real exchange rates. We'll start with nominal because that's really easy. Nominal exchange rate is the rate you see. Much like nominal interest rates, that's the rate you see. And what do you think we do to nominal rates to get a real rate? Well, we'll adjust it for inflation, right? You'd be correct. But there are two countries involved, which means there are two inflation rates. Just a little peek ahead. But getting from a nominal exchange rate to a real exchange rate means we're going to do something with the nominal price that we see with respect to the inflation rates in both countries, right? So let's deal with this nominal rate we see. We call it a spot rate. And the spot rate is the rate at which these two currencies are able to be exchanged for at that point in time. So euro.us, expressed in the ratio convention, USD over euro, we can look up a spot rate. That is a nominal exchange rate. So we're going to denote a nominal exchange rate from here on in with a capital letter S to mean spot rate. And you'll notice here, for the subnotation, I have D over F, domestic over foreign. When a spot rate is expressed in this format, domestic over foreign, we say that this is a direct exchange rate. When it's expressed as S, F over D, we will call this an indirect exchange rate. So what does it mean? It means nothing. It's just a convention. It's just to be aware that if we're talking about a direct exchange rate, the base currency is the foreign currency. When we're talking about an indirect exchange rate, the base currency is the domestic currency. That may sound fairly straightforward, but again, it's really just a convention. It's just a way that we express a currency because we're going to do some math later on, and it matters. So by having some way that's not arbitrary, the math will work out. But let me just show you that this spot exchange rate, D over F, is not as simple as what you think it would be, and why most of the time you can just ignore that convention. Let's say that I'm in well, I live in Canada. I'm sure you all know that. I live in Canada, and let's say that I'm interested in the US dollar. Let's see if we can't label these domestic and foreign. Which would be my domestic currency? I don't think it would take much to say, well, you live in Canada, that's your domestic currency. You live in the US, there's your foreign currency. Anybody in grade 2 can solve that. Excellent. That's exactly right. So what would be a direct quote? Well, if it's in the form D over F, a direct quote would be CAD over USD, or the USD.CAD. There's my direct quote. Great. Let's move. Well, no, I'll stay in Canada. Let's not move. Let's just move my interests around. Now I'm interested in the US dollar, and I'm interested in the Mexican peso. Which one's the foreign currency? Now, if you take a minute and think about that, you'll come back with an answer of, yeah, that's right. You're in Canada. So the US dollar is the foreign currency. And somebody may say, but he's in Canada. The Mexican peso is the foreign currency. In fact, they're both foreign currencies. So now express it in a direct exchange rate. Well, you would have F over F. What you assign to be the domestic currency and what you assign to be the foreign currency, from your point of view, could be completely arbitrary. Now, there is a reason why you'd want one as the domestic and one as the foreign. When we trade currencies, we trade the first of the pair. We make our bet on the first, but we get paid in the second currency. So if I'm trading the euro.us, all my gains and losses will accrue in US dollars. So if I'm trading the US and the Mexican, I would first say, how do I want to be paid? In US dollars or in Mexican pesos? And if I want to be traded in US dollars, the Mexican peso will be the base, which will be the foreign currency. The US will be the domestic currency. If I want to be paid in pesos, it's the other way around. So this and this are just as popular. So when we look at direct quotes and indirect quotes, there's nothing insignificant or nothing less significant about an indirect quote versus a direct quote. I want to get that out of the way now. All right, so let's continue on here. Let's set up something here because we're going to introduce something called purchasing power parity, which really doesn't work, but it's used later on in some theories. So let's introduce what this thing means. And of course, it's economics, so we need to assume a whole bunch of the real world away. So let's assume a world of homogeneous goods and services. B, no market frictions, and C, no trade barriers. That means no capital restrictions. This is a world without a Donald Trump, if you can imagine that. That'll be a world without a Donald Trump. We have to assume him away now for our economic model to work. So if an iPad cost £500 or $750, we would expect the exchange rate to be 1.5. Remember, the base is 1. So 1 pound would buy 150 US. So if we have 500 pounds, at this exchange rate, we would have 750 US. This sum of money and this sum of money have the same purchasing power, 1 iPad. So this exchange rate is called a purchasing power parity exchange rate, because at that rate, there's parity among purchasing power between the two countries. Now, let's express this as a theory. And this purchasing power parity holds in this theory for all goods or baskets of goods. But these assumptions rarely satisfied, if ever. There's some reality check here. Nominal exchange rates exhibit persistent deviations from purchasing power parity. So when you get to level 2, there's a lot more about currencies there. We start to ask the question is there something in purchasing power parity that can tell us whether a currency is overvalued or undervalued? Well, if they exhibit persistent deviations from purchasing power parity, maybe not. But we'll see more of that at level 2. It's important to introduce that to you now, that there is some theory out there between how exchange rates are determined, and one of those theories is the idea of purchasing power parity, that exchange rates will find the rate at which there is no more ability to arbitrage goods. Let me explain that. Let's say this rate was 1.6, not 1.5. A British pound could buy 160 US. Well, 500 pounds would now buy $800. I'd take the $800, spend $750 on an iPad, and I'd walk away with $50. Why spend $500 on an iPad when I can exchange that $500, get the same iPad and $50? That's called goods arbitrage. And for goods arbitrage to work, you need frictionless markets and no trade barriers. But clearly, those things do exist, so it doesn't really work, which means there's nothing really, the arbitrage argument is not, there's nothing really forcing this exchange rate to exhibit this characteristic. Let's look at real exchange rates. And real exchange rates, how exchange rates are determined, arbitrage good. And I'd walk away with $50. And for goods arbitrage to work, the argument is, well, there's the nominal exchange rate, there's the spot rate. Where do I look to find the real exchange rate? You have to construct it yourself. So most places don't even bother, because even if you did construct it, well, you can't buy at that exchange rate. You either want or don't want the currency at the nominal exchange rate. But there is some benefit to looking at the real exchange rate. But this takes us, we got to sort of get two things straight in our mind. So let's take a small example. Let's say that you live in A land. This is country A, this is country B. We'll call this A land, we'll call this B land. So you live in A land, and you want to buy from B land. So you're buying some stuff from B land. What would change your cost of buying from B land? What would change your cost? Well, there are two things that would make buying from B land more or less expensive. If the exchange rate between A and B went up. In other words, there's our base currency, there's A. So we read it this way, $1 buys so much of A. So if the exchange rate went up, you would need more of A to get 1B. That would make it more expensive in A land to buy B land. So if the exchange rate goes up such that you need more A land dollars to buy the same B land dollars, whatever goods are in this country will become more expensive purely by the exchange rate. There's one way that changes the price. The other way that changes the price is, let's say the exchange rate stays constant, but there's inflation in this country so that the price level in this country keeps going up. The price level in this country is flat and the exchange rate is flat. If inflation here is going up, well, you got to keep paying the higher and higher prices. So imagine that you have inflation in B land and the exchange rate is going up at the same time. It becomes even more and more expensive for an A lander to buy B lander goods. The A lander will suffer a loss of purchasing power in terms of B land goods and services, because the same amount of money will buy fewer and fewer products. Your purchasing power will decrease in terms of B land's goods and services. Okay, we get that, right? But let's not forget about A land. We've already talked about the exchange rate between them. We've talked about inflation. Well, A land can have inflation. If the CPI in A land is increasing, in other words, if inflation is increasing, and I've written this in pink, listen up, this is an important point, and incomes and CPI move together. You can't just have the price level going up to get to the conclusion we're about to get to. If the price level is going up, we must also assume that it's bringing incomes along, so that incomes are rising at the rate of inflation. That's not always true, especially for the lower income brackets. The bottom 70% really don't get that effect. They actually get hurt by inflation, but we'll assume this right now. So if the inflation rate in A land is going up and incomes move along, and we have a flat exchange rate and a flat inflation rate here, A land will have increased purchasing power because their incomes will rise with the inflation rate here, traded at a constant exchange rate and buying at constant inflation here. A lander will gain purchasing power in terms of B land's goods and services. So let's bring all three together now. Let's figure out what happens to purchasing power in terms of the CPI in A land, the CPI in B land, and the exchange rate. Is there a way to capture all three variables at one time? Yes, there is. Let's lead into this, and this is what we're going for down here, but I want you to see it intuitively, right? The foreign price level in domestic currency. So let's price out a basket of goods here that are subject to inflation in terms of dollars here. Well, the first thing we need to do is convert our dollars into B land dollars. There's the exchange rate. And then we'll multiply it by whatever the rate of inflation is in this country. So we'll take a dollar, we'll exchange it for here, and then we'll multiply that by whatever the price level is to figure out what this is going to cost. So there we go. There's the foreign price level in the domestic currency, the spot rate times the CPI in B land. And if CPI sub A is the price level in A land, the real exchange rate is the nominal spot rate multiplied by the ratio of their two price indices, CPI in B land divided by CPI in A land. That's how we get to a real exchange rate. So that the real exchange rate takes into consideration the inflation rates in the two countries. That's all it's doing. Notice that if we take this term out, what is this? That's the nominal exchange rate. So all we're doing, remember when we adjust for inflation, when we go from a nominal interest rate to a real interest rate, what are we doing? We're controlling for inflation. Well, here's the exchange rate. We got to control for inflation. But remember, currencies are traded in pairs, so we need a pair. And you just flip it, B over A. And all we're doing is we're taking the spot. Want to buy goods and services somewhere in the Eurozone that requires us to have euros. And we know that the real exchange rate between these two countries is the spot rate multiplied by the ratio of their CPIs. Notice it's a pound over euro, but